Welcome back. We continue our coverage of the worsening relations between South Africa and the United States, largely over misinformation about the country's land reform policies. The recent AfriForum and Solidarity mission to the U.S. has emphasized the racial divisions among South Africans. To help us unpack the impact of this misinformation on the country's race relations, I'm joined by Director of Media Monitoring Africa, William Bird. Mr. Bird, thank you so much for your time and for joining us this evening. Now, last week, Saturday, my colleague Masake Kana spoke to Professor Amanda Hoos of the Stellenbosch University about this recent rise of racial intolerance among South Africans following the breakdown of these relations between South Africa and the U.S. And Prof. Hoos faced backlash from a former colonel within the U.S. on her comments of dispelling the land grabs in South Africa. How prevalent is misinformation in news reporting, particularly regarding international relations like these between South Africa and the U.S.? And what are the common sources of this misinformation?
Hi, good evening. Well, until fairly recently, it used to be, actors using particular crises for their own ends. Now we know that much of this disinformation is coming from the presidency itself. The presidency of the United States is putting forward these things, and then he has a number of supporters who ably aid and abet that particular process, including people like Elon Musk, who owns one of the social media platforms and has, one of the biggest followings on that particular platform. So when you've got people with significant levels of power and significant influence, if they go and spread something, it's very easy for that to be picked up and for that to hold sway with a lot of people, because legitimately so they are public. Well, in the case of President Trump, he's a legitimately elected leader of the United States of America, but that doesn't mean that he should be able to get away with just simply lying about things. I think what's been clever about this particular process, and I say that ironically, is that it's very much like the WMC strategy we saw under state capture, where, with a lot of these things, there's certainly elements of truth to them. And it's not to say that there isn't significant challenges around the land question in South Africa. It's not to say that we also don't have significantly high and unacceptably high levels of violent crime in South Africa, and that people die, and they die wherever they are, whether they're on farms or in their homes. So these things are all true. We also have high levels of racism and among the highest levels of inequality anywhere in the world. So that means that it's very ripe, fertile ground for people to use that for their own ends. Because it's such an emotive issue, because of the various histories deeply embedded in all of these issues, it's the perfect bed, if you like, to make mis and disinformation on, precisely because it really gets it, as the expression goes, it touches all of us on our studio. It's the sort of thing that makes you easily angry, easily anxious, which is exactly the thing that you need to use for a mis and disinformation campaign. The question we have to ask is, to what end is this being done, and to what purpose? And that's really, for me, whether that's going to help us unpack and ultimately de-link and destabilize this particular mis and disinformation campaign.
And how does misinformation just affect public perception, especially when it comes to diplomatic relations?
I mean, it impacts everything. I think one of the most effective side effects of mis and disinformation is that it leaves viewers feeling disempowered. It frequently also leaves them feeling like they don't want to watch the news, they don't want to engage with it because it's either too much going on. There's a deluge at the moment of all of these kinds of things hitting us from all sides. And what that tends to do is it discourages people from engaging, from wanting to engage in politics, from wanting to think about and engage in governance. So it's fundamentally a deeply, deeply anti-democratic process, and that's why we need to fight it. It's why we need to be completely cynical about those that spread it and wonder what is their real motive. Because to be clear, even if some of the things they were saying are true, there's nowhere that you could say in the world that South Africa has the worst land grab problem anywhere in the world, right? That is by far and away the least of our human rights egregious challenges that we have in South Africa. And yet, that's the one that's being picked on. That's the one that's becoming the focus of this particular thing, precisely because it's very good distraction from other issues that are really there. I think a lot more of this has to do with South Africa's positioning and progressive approach in many respects in relation to the G20, which is again pushing for something that is exactly the antithesis of what America's pushing for. America is pushing at the moment for isolationism. They're pushing for a very strong form of nationalism, where South Africa, because of the role in the G20, is pushing for traditional multilateralism, for collaboration, for working together to address all of these difficult challenges that the world is facing. Now, when you've got a country that's trying to do that, what do you need to do with them? You need to destabilize, you need to discredit them, you need to give them something else that's going to take away their attention and their focus from actually doing what they're trying to do. So I think that we need to be cautious about that and say, well, let's look at what we are actually pushing for as a country in relation to the G20. What are the options that we should be addressing around them, around climate change, around the land question, legitimate issues around that, around basic issues of dignity and equality. These are the fundamental issues we need to be dealing with. These kinds of things are around distraction, the emotive language that they use, the clear and obvious efforts to undermine our nation's good standing are things that we know that we need to say, well, you may think that, but we know that we know what you're up to, and we're not going to fall for it. You know, we're not a stupid and gullible people. And the biggest evidence for that is under apartheid, when the Nationalist Party government had almost complete control over all of the media. People were consuming the SABC as a giant propaganda machine, but they didn't believe it. Why? Because their lived reality said and showed them something different. So we've got a history in South Africa of challenging this kind of nonsense. So I'm very confident that actually we'll be able to resist those kinds of approaches. The bigger issue, of course, is what the impact of this will be for the various multilateral efforts that we're involved in.
And just for that impact not to be as hard as it seemingly is, how much of a responsibility lies on the South African media itself to be dispelling this information?
I think every time we see those those kinds of pieces of falsehoods, whether they're outright lies, whether they're misinformation, whether they're just stretching the thing, I think we need to call it out. Our media must make sure that they call out every time someone says something that's not true. They need to be challenged, and they need to say, this is the actual fact. This is what's the reality on the ground, and remind people to say, when someone's trying to make you feel angry and anxious about your country, when they're stirring racial division, when they're making all sorts of accusations that are unfounded, the question to ask isn't to say, oh, I hate that person and they're awful. The thing to do is to say, hold on a moment, why are they saying this? What are they doing this for? What is their purpose? In other words, remove the strong negative emotional response from that and look at it and say, well, what are they trying to do? In the same way as you would when people spread rumors at school and all sorts of nasty things, the best way of dealing with those isn't to succumb to those, but to understand the purpose of the person that's seeking to spread those rumors.
And as media monitoring, I mean, what are some of the challenges that you face in monitoring misinformation? How does the rapid spread of information, especially on social media, complicate this task?
Well, I mean, things have gone completely crazy. There's a very clear and direct strategy that's being used by the United States at the moment, where what they're doing is they are hitting us with a deluge of issues, of queries, of comments, of things that are completely outrageous. You know, it's not just one thing that gives us enough time to focus on it. It's that they attack us for all sorts of things. So now it's not just the land question. It's not just the issue around farmers and giving them refugee status. It's not just the AGOA. It's not just the G20 and the ICJ case. It's now also, you know, they got rid of our ambassador now from America. They are talking about moving and closing the consulate in Johannesburg because of the wanting to rename a street. Now, these are all things that mean that for us to monitor and to respond to them, obviously it's increasingly hard. And again, That's exactly their strategy. They are hoping that we are going to be so invested in dealing with the deluge of information that they're hitting us with that we are unable to act, that we're unable to see what it is exactly that they're up to. Again, the best way forward for that is to make sure that journalists can do their job well, for us to hold journalism account, for us to call out these things, for us to monitor as much as we can, record it, archive it, because the thing about all of this is it may seem interminable now, but this will pass, and at some point there will be forms of accountability for these people. Evil wins for a time, but in the end, it always loses.
It certainly does. I mean, you're speaking of that responsibility of media organizations. What about governments and civil society? What is it that people can do on the ground to combat misinformation?
I mean, I think that the government's response generally has been, I think, broadly to be welcomed. You know, they've responded with, I mean, aside from Ambassador Rasool's unfortunate comments, even though what he said may well be true, you know, that as an ambassador, you know, ambassadors the world over, when faced with the most extraordinary things, always keep a calm face and are diplomats. That's in their name. They're diplomats, right? And he crossed that line with, even as I said, what he may well have said is true. I think government needs to, particularly our government, needs to show that we're going to stick to our constitutional values of dignity and equality, that we're going to stick to the fact that we are a young, emerging, but proud democratic state, and all government ministers need to adhere to and abide by that. For civil society, again, it's about calling these things out. It's about making sure that we continue to actually address the issues and challenges that we're facing. We have extraordinary levels of poverty in our country. We have children that are malnourished, that are starving in the Eastern Cape. We have, you know, levels of gender-based violence that are unacceptable. So these are things that we need to be making sure that we address. We need to get our economy going. What we mustn't do is allow ourselves to be diverted, to be polarized, to be distracted from efforts that are out there that seek fundamentally to undermine and destroy our democracy. Millions of people gave their lives too hard for our democracy to be where it is today. I don't think we can let some raggedy lunatics just come in and attack and seek to destroy that. You know, they didn't succeed when they had all the guns that they could possibly get. They're not going to succeed this time. So we must stand firm on this and ensure that we abide by that. And that means media need to do their job, because news media and news organizations are as critical to a democratic state as is having a stable functioning government, as is having a stable parliament, as is having a stable judiciary.
William, thank you so much for your time and for speaking to us this evening. That was William Bird, the Director at Media Monitoring Africa, speaking to us about misinformation and just the role of civil society as well as the media in dispelling some of this misinformation.